October 14, 1958, 11:15 p.m. The Lenox Lounge, 288 Lenox Avenue. The bullet wasn't meant for flesh, it was meant for a message. It slammed into the mahogany bar top, inches from a glass of top-shelf scotch, sending shards of amber liquid and crystal flying like shrapnel. The music stopped instantly. The laughter died in 70 throats. 3 men in heavy wool coats stood at the entrance, silhouettes against the rain-slicked pavement of Lenox Avenue. The leader, a scar-faced enforcer from the Bronx, held a smoking .45 caliber pistol. He didn't look at the patrons cowering under tables. He looked directly at the empty booth in the back booth number 1. The King's booth. The lease is up, the gunman shouted, his voice cracking with adrenaline. Tell Johnson his rent is overdue. Harlem belongs to the commission now. 3,000 miles away, inside a 5x9 concrete box surrounded by the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat on his cot. He was inmate 1117. He had no gun. He had no phone. He had no soldiers within shouting distance. Yet, in that moment of silence in the Lenox Lounge, every soul present knew the truth. The man in the cell was more dangerous than the man with the gun, and the bill for that bullet would be paid in blood. 4 weeks earlier, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was a ghost in his own kingdom. Convicted on a trumped-up drug conspiracy charge in 1952, the Godfather of Harlem had been shipped to the most secure prison in America, Alcatraz. For 6 years, the streets of Harlem had whispered his name like a prayer or a curse, depending on who you asked. He wasn't just a gangster. He was the dam holding back the flood. He was the buffer between the black community and the predatory Italian Mafia families downtown. Even from a cage, his intellect was sharp enough to cut glass. He read Nietzsche, played chess by mail, and ran a shadow government through coded letters and whispered instructions passed during visitation hours. The year 1958 was a powder keg for organized crime. The Appalachian meeting had happened the year prior, exposing the Mafia to the FBI and the public. The heat was on. The 5 families, specifically the Genovese crime family, were scrambling for revenue to cover legal fees and bribe judges. They looked north to Harlem and saw a gold mine left unguarded. The numbers racket, the illegal lottery, was generating millions, and the Italian bosses decided the black tax was no longer enough. They wanted the whole operation. They wanted to cut out the middleman. They wanted to erase Bumpy Johnson. The stakes were astronomical. We are talking about pocket change. We are talking about an estimated $50 million a year economy moving through the barbershops, beauty parlors, and tenements of Harlem. Control of the numbers meant control of the neighborhood. The Genovese family, led by the ambitious and ruthless acting boss Vito Genovese, believed that with Bumpy locked in the rock, the chain of command was broken. They saw a headless body ready for butchering. They didn't realize the head was still thinking, plotting, and watching from across the continent. The threat arrived in the form of Capo Crazy Joey Gallo and his crew, though they operated under the umbrella of the Genovese administration. But the specific man tasked with breaking Harlem was a heavy hitter named Salvatore "Sal the Hammer" Moretti. Moretti was a brute, a man who lacked Bumpy's finesse but made up for it with terrifying violence. He had made his bones crushing union strikes on the waterfront, breaking knees with lead pipes and leaving bodies in the foundations of Queens housing projects. Moretti didn't want a partnership. He wanted total submission. His mandate from downtown was clear: intimidate the independent black bankers, seize the policy slips, and redirect the cash flow to Italian coffers. He viewed the Harlem bankers not as business associates, but as property. He was dangerous because he didn't respect the delicate ecosystem Bumpy had built. Bumpy operated with the degree of community consent. He paid rent, bought turkeys, and kept the streets relatively orderly. Moretti brought chaos. In just 1 month, his crew had firebombed 3 collection spots on 125th Street and hospitalized 2 runners. They pistol-whipped a grandmother collecting bets on 135th Street. The direct threat came via message sent to Bumpy's wife, Mime Hatcher Johnson. A dead canary was left on her doorstep at their apartment on 191st Street. The note attached was simple and chilling. The bird can't sing in a cage. The cats are eating tonight. It was an ultimatum. Surrender the numbers, or we burn the kingdom to the ground while you watch from your island. October 25th, 1958, 12 a.m. Sal Moretti decided to formalize the takeover. He called a meeting at the Golden Gate Ballroom on 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue. It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. Every major black numbers banker in Harlem was ordered to attend. If they didn't show, they were out of business permanently. The plan was simple: intimidation. Moretti intended to walk in with 20 armed men, lay down the new percentages, 60% to the Italians, 40% to the bankers, and execute anyone who objected. It was a classic mob power move. He believed the bankers were sheep without their shepherd. The atmosphere inside the Golden Gate Ballroom was suffocating. The massive dance floor, usually alive with the Lindy Hop and jazz, was stark and empty save for a single long table set up in the center. The air smelled of floor wax and fear. 25 Harlem bankers sat in folding chairs, their faces tight. They were men and women who had survived the Depression and police raids, but tonight they looked like children waiting for a beating. At 12:15 a.m., the double doors swung open with a violent crash. Sal Moretti strode in, flanked by 18 soldiers. They wore long trench coats, the bulges of shotguns and Tommy guns obvious underneath. The sound of their hard-soled shoes on the parquet floor echoed like gunshots. Clack, clack, clack. Gentlemen. Ladies, Moretti sneered, stopping at the head of the table. He lit a cigar, the flare of the match illuminating his pockmarked face. Management has changed. The freelance days are over. He threw a leather satchel on the table. This bag gets filled every Friday. 135th Street drop. If it's light, we take fingers. If it's empty, we take heads. The silence stretched. A banker named Dollar Bill tried to stand. One of Moretti's goons racked the slide of a shotgun. CHK, CHK. Dollar Bill sat down, sweat beading on his forehead. Bumpy isn't here to save you, Moretti laughed, the sound bouncing off the high ceilings. Bumpy is looking at seagulls and eating slop. He's a memory. I am the reality. Moretti paced the line of bankers, blowing smoke in their faces. You have 5 minutes to pledge loyalty, kiss the ring, or close the casket. The tension was a physical weight. The bankers looked at each other, desperate, terrified. They knew Bumpy would never bow, but Bumpy was 3,000 miles away. Survival instinct was kicking in. Then, at 12:22 a.m., the service door behind the stage creaked open. It wasn't a slam, it was a slow, deliberate opening. A single man walked out. He wasn't a gangster. He was an old man, stooped over, wearing a janitor's uniform. He pushed a mop bucket on squeaky wheels. Squeak, 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 squeak. Moretti spun around. Get that bum out of here. The old man didn't stop. He pushed the bucket right up to Moretti's polished shoes. He reached into the dirty water. He didn't pull out a sponge. What Moretti didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson played chess by mail, and he had sent his move 2 weeks ago. The janitor pulled out a waterproof packet. He placed it on the table next to Moretti's leather bag. Inside was a single object, a neatly folded copy of the San Francisco Chronicle, dated 3 days prior. Bumpy had known all along. Through his lawyer and his wife Mamie, he had orchestrated a defense that didn't require him to be in the room. He knew Moretti was a brute, but he also knew Moretti answered to higher-ups, specifically Vito Genovese. And Bumpy knew what terrified Vito Genovese more than lost money: narcotic charges. 2 weeks earlier, Alcatraz visiting room. Bumpy had sat across from his attorney. He didn't speak about violence. He spoke about leverage. He knew where the bodies were buried. Literally and metaphorically, he had been holding on to a piece of information for 5 years, an insurance policy against exactly this moment. The old janitor unfolded the newspaper. Circled in red grease pencil was a small article about a heroin bust in East Harlem, but taped to the newspaper was a Polaroid photo. The photo showed a meeting, not a Harlem meeting, a meeting in Greenwich Village between Moretti and an undercover federal narcotics agent. It was grainy, but it was undeniable. Bumpy's people hadn't taken the photo. Bumpy had bought the photo from a corrupt cop on his payroll years ago, saving it for a rainy day. It proved Moretti was sloppy. It proved Moretti had led the feds right to the Genovese supply lines. The twist: Bumpy wasn't threatening to kill Moretti. He was threatening to expose him to his own bosses. Mr. N. Johnson sends his regards, the old janitor said. His voice wasn't shaky, it was steel. He pulled the telephone from the bucket, a rotary phone with a long extension cord plugged into the stage outlet. It's for you, the janitor said. Moretti looked at the phone like it was a bomb. He picked up the receiver. Sal, a voice said on the other end. It wasn't Bumpy. It was the consigliere of the Genovese family. You're making too much noise, Sal. The man in the box says you're drawing heat. He says you're meeting with feds. That's a lie, Moretti screamed, looking at the photo. The picture says different, the voice on the phone said, cold as ice. Pack up. Leave Harlem. Tonight. If you touch one of Johnson's people, we hand you to the FBI ourselves. The line went dead. Bumpy hadn't used a gun. He hadn't used a bomb. He had used the Mafia's own paranoia against them. He had framed the framer. October 25th, 1958, 12:35 a.m. Sal Moretti looked at the phone, then at the bankers, then at the old janitor. The color drained from his face. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by the primal fear of a man who realizes he is standing on a trap door. "Let's go," Moretti whispered to his men. "What about the money?" one of his soldiers asked. "Leave it," Moretti hissed. He backed away from the table, eyes darting to the shadows, expecting a bullet that wasn't coming. The Italians retreated, their footsteps hurried and clumsy, a stark contrast to their confident entrance. The room held its breath for 10 seconds after the doors swung shut. Then, pandemonium. The bankers erupted, not in cheers, but in disbelief. The old janitor picked up the newspaper and the photo, placed them back in his bucket, and wheeled it away. Squeak! 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 The ripple effects were immediate. By sunrise, the Genovese family pulled their crews back to 110th Street. The tax remained at the old rate, the bumpy rate. No hostile takeover, no blood war. The independent bankers of Harlem realized that even in chains, Bumpy Johnson was the only roof over their heads. In Alcatraz, Bumpy Johnson sat on his cot, staring at the gray ceiling. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply moved a white pawn forward on his small magnetic chess set. He had bought Harlem another few years of peace. He had reminded the world that a king is a king, whether he sits on a throne or a toilet in a federal prison. This confrontation proved that Bumpy Johnson's power was never about muscle. It was about intellect. While other gangsters relied on the size of their guns, Bumpy relied on the size of his information network. He understood that in the underworld, secrets were more lethal than bullets. This moment matters historically because it preserved black ownership of the Harlem rackets for another decade. It prevented a total hostile takeover by the Italian Mafia during a vulnerable period. It cemented Bumpy's legend not just as a tough guy but as a professor of the streets. He showed that physical incarceration could not contain a strategic mind. The universal lesson here is profound. True power is presence in absence. If your influence stops the moment you leave the room, you were never really in charge. Bumpy built a system so robust, a reputation so terrifying, and a network so deep that he could checkmate a killer from 3,000 miles away without lifting a finger. If this story blew your mind, if you respect a man who can win a war from a prison cell, smash that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more true stories from the Harlem underworld. And tell me in the comments, was Bumpy Johnson the smartest gangster in American history? Next week, we're breaking down the time Bumpy kidnapped a mob boss for a game of chess. You can't make this stuff up.